Hey everybody, welcome to the last week of our NaNoWriMo stream series. Or if you've been following along, you know it's more of a National Book Writing Month deal going on here on Manuscripts YouTube. We're talking about both fiction and nonfiction books, and each week we've been taking you through the drafting process, however long that might be taking you, whether it's a month, whether it's shorter, whether it's longer, it doesn't matter. It's your pace, and that's the pace we're going at with this. And we finally, after 5 weeks of streams talking about different topics with drafting, have come to the topic of editing, what follows the drafting process. And I'm Vincent Kashani. I'm joined by fellow author Kyra Ann Dawkins, and was joined by fellow author Emily Vanderbilt. I'm sure she'll pop back in here. How are you doing, Kyra?
I'm doing all right, Vincent. Just gotta take it one day at a time, But we're all in this together in this creative journey, and I'm glad we get to celebrate National Book Writing Month really all year round.
That is amazing to hear, and I love that you said we're all in this together, because that really ties into the topic of today's talk and conversation. Is with editing, it's very much so a collaborative process, at least to a certain extent, that some authors may not be aware of. We'll get to that a little later on one of the later questions, but to sort of start things off, and Emily is back here joining us, the question that I wanted to throw and pose to you guys in terms of starting out your self-editing journey is the editing process goes from larger scale, developmental, to smaller scale, and that's copy editing. Why is this the case? And so I sort of wanted to take this back to earlier when we were talking about drafting and why we keep editing and drafting separate. And that is because if you edit your book on the large scale, the developmental scale, the story structure, the major character arcs, the overall number of chapters, how you're communicating your story on that wider scale, if you're editing on that large scale and on the small finite scale, the grammar, the punctuation, all the stuff that would go into normally editing an actual copy, the copy material of your manuscript. If you're doing those at the same time, you are going to be wasting a lot of time on the smaller scale, because you'll edit that copy, you'll edit your syntax, you'll edit how that chapter sounds, but then you may not even need that chapter. So that's why there's very distinct, rough draft and later cleaner drafts that go on. So that's sort of the mindset that we've had coming into this. So why exactly in editing, how exactly does that look? And so my thought with that is not too different at all. Basically, you start with edits on the large scale. Make it its own distinct process. You're doing developmental edits, and that will be, okay, does the story make sense at this point? Does this chapter need to be here where it is? Does this other character arc make sense? Does this contribute in this way? And that will force you to sort of, okay, I'm going to change this chapter. I'm going to get rid of this character arc, or I'm going to fundamentally change my story in a certain way. And then there will later be a process where you go in and clean up that version of the draft. So you might be on your second, third, fourth, beyond draft before you even start getting to the small scale, before you actually start editing copy. And so Kyra, and then Emily, if Emily's Wi-Fi works and she's able to pop in here, how exactly does this look for you? And do you have any piece of advice in terms of going from large scale to smaller scale later on in terms of editing? Oh, here, you were muted.
I'm on mute.
There we go. Now you're back.
Oh, there we go. I concur with all affirmation statements thus far. I mean, really, a huge part of this is, okay, so something that I really struggle with throughout the drafting process is really navigating, like silencing my self-editor, because I know that the editing phase is going to be rigorous later on. So I think that's something that's really helpful in organizing the drafting process that's iterative, like you described, and the editing process that's iterative is compartmentalization. As you were saying, you can't tackle all problems at the same time. Something that we talk about within our community here at Manuscripts is the idea of chunking. When you go through a manuscript, particularly in its earlier phase, instead of trying to go through, sometimes you can go through chapter by chapter, But other times you can go through problem by problem to indicate, okay, so I've noticed in this initial draft that I don't do a good enough job differentiating my characters through dialogue, or I notice that my tenses are inconsistent. Things like that. For me, it's easier to compartmentalize in terms of what problems can I solve and what can I solve throughout, versus trying to be like, okay, here's this chapter, there are a bunch of things wrong with it. It's better to try to capture trends and work through trends rather than trying to fix an entire image, if that makes sense.
That makes a lot of sense. It definitely makes a lot of sense, especially from personal experience. It makes a ton of sense. And I had brought this up earlier, but I was writing from when I was very young. So I was doing everything at once and I didn't know any better. Or if I did know better, I thought I was better. I could handle all these things at once and I didn't compartmentalize. And it cost me lots and lots of time editing small scale while I was addressing a big problem or a pattern in my book. And if I would have just focused on the pattern first, like you were saying, whatever that pattern might be, whether it's a certain character just isn't right within your book, or certain way of communicating your story on the large scale is not working, definitely tackling those problems in its own process first is how to go about it. And I think that kind of almost leads into the next question that we've got here, and Emily's around for it. Hopefully the gods of internet will allow us to have her take this one as well. Hey, so we were actually just getting on to the next question with this, and it's what is the difference between the editing mindset and the drafting mindset? And Kyra, if you want to take this one first while Emily kind of comes in here. Yes, you were touching on that a little bit, how you kind of have to push your editing mindset to the side while you're drafting, and then also the compartmentalizing while you're even editing. So how do you keep those distinct, and what are sort of the differences between them, at least from your point of view and from your experiences?
Right. So people have heard the saying, draft without judgment, edit without mercy, or write without judgment, or write without judgment, edit without mercy kind of thing.
Yes. Yeah.
For me, that is kind of the shifts in my mentalities. Like once I get to editing, it's all about killing your darlings. It's all about it's like, for me, it's about, in drafting, it's about exploration. In editing, it's about refinement. So there are two different minds that operate, at least for me, throughout the process. Drafting, Kyra, is following flow, is following rhythm, is following image. Editing, Kyra, is seeking patterns and interweaving consistency. Because at the end of the day, your readers, depending on really all readers, are searching for both. Some people are going to have a greater gravitation towards one or the other, but both of those things are integral to a structurally sound and emotionally compelling story. So for me, in my mind, from a structural standpoint, I get to really lead with my emotions in drafting, and I can refine the emotions and the images I want to convey through editing. So that's kind of the big shift from an actual action perspective. For example, I do a lot of drafting just from a day-to-day practical standpoint.
Yeah.
I do a lot of my drafting handwritten out, because that sort of helps me from seeing underlined red stuff, or being as concerned about triggering my internal editor. But my editing mind is very hyper, okay, how can I maximize this from a grammar standpoint? How can I make sure that this tone is consistent, et cetera, et cetera? So one is very much about me being a vessel for a story in drafting. And the second, the editing process or editing mindset is more of a curation of that story. Once the story you've become the vessel, what can you do to then become the presenter or the reciter?
I love that because you have a tangible item in front of you that you've worked on while you're drafting. You have that manuscript, you're done with it, in terms of that current form. And now your job, like you're saying, is being a curator of the ideas and themes and writing that you have already and that you've already done, and compiling it in a more neat, presentable, engaging, better way, really. And I think those are very much two different acts. And we had a question earlier in one of the earlier streams for you, Kyra, about that writing by hand mindset. Oh no, Emily's gotten again. That writing by hand mindset. And I think, if people want to go back and listen to that conversation, you had a lot of good insights about, even if you're not physically writing by hand, which is something I typically don't do, thinking with that in mind is really important. And now that you're done drafting your manuscript, we're kind of all seeing, oh my gosh, that's why it was important, because now I have to switch gears and be the curator. And something we didn't mention with this first question that's important to note is somewhere in between the large scale and the small scale is the scale of, is the part where you bring in different people, you bring in beta readers, you bring in different people to refine your ideas. So when you're showing outside forces and outside people, your manuscript somewhere in the middle in between these, and it's sort of its own step in the editing process. I wanted to mention that just because it is important, sort of for our next question. And this is one that I think about a lot, and I wonder how different authors have different experiences with it. And the topic today is called Intro to Self-Editing. But what exactly is that, and what's the difference between editing by yourself or editing on a publisher's schedule? And now we've talked about setting due dates for yourself. We did, even in the last video, in the last two streams on this, talk about, in particular, drafting, how to motivate yourself and push yourself and do it on your own. Because even for people who end up, traditionally publishing their book, drafting is usually a more solitary part of the process. And a lot of times you set your own due dates. You're writing this manuscript on your own and presenting it to different agents or to different publishers, whether it's small or indie publishers. You're doing that on your own. And now with editing, things start to branch off depending on what type of publishing you're doing. And editing is very dependent on publishing model and vice versa. And that's something that's new for somebody who's just into writing. I like drafting. I like creating ideas. To then think, oh my gosh, part of my writing process is now very heavily being dictated by the type of publishing and outward facing and marketing, all these kinds of things. They're starting to come into the equation. And it's kind of scary and it's kind of weird. And it's super different for everyone. And so obviously you and I, and obviously Emily as well, we talked about this, me and Emily talked about this a week or two ago. We had a very similar publishing model and route. Heck, we had the same publisher. So we had similar experiences in terms of editing on a schedule that was set by someone else.
Right.
Now, do you have advice on that type of process in particular? Or maybe even not advice, maybe just talking about some of the pros and cons of working with editing and working within a structure that's being set and established by somebody else and their schedule.
So the biggest one, unsurprisingly, is accountability.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, as much as we want to insist that we are self-accountable, and in many ways as writers we are, because we drafted the darn thing, that only 2% of people ever actually write books, and of that percentage, 2% of people subsequently publish that books, right? So with that being said, I think that as we navigate this terrain, when you have an external structure being imposed on you, it's like school. I mean, many of us have experienced school. When you submit a paper, you have to submit a paper on time, otherwise it's going to impact your grade. With a publisher, particularly when there's money involved, particularly when there's publishing timelines involved, you receive the direct consequences for not doing things in a timely manner. So I think that a publisher schedule really holds you accountable to consistent progress. And yes, it's rigorous and at times overwhelming, but again, that kind of coincides with school also.
Yeah.
So I think that's different from self-editing in that, yes, self-editing, you can give yourself the space that you need, but sometimes you might grant yourself too much space. It's harder to hold yourself to that caliber of discipline, because also inside of that superstructure of deadlines being imposed on you, that in meeting that deadline, you're going to get the reward of progress. But for self-editing, or setting deadlines for yourself on that, like there might be progress, but you just, if you keep pushing the marker further and further and further and further, you start to lose momentum. So I would say that ultimately self-editing is possible, but I think that one of the best ways to incentivize yourself to be intentional in self-editing is reminding yourself that this book is going to be in dialogue with other people, or having, like, even if you don't have an additional publisher that's imposing deadlines on you, or an editor, even if you're just holding yourself accountable to telling another person that you completed a task, that's a way to remind yourself that this is not just something contained within you. This is something that you hope to share with the world someday.
I love that, because, you know, I'm thinking about my own publishing process and the similarities that we had under a structure that's almost like school, and being able to edit with sort of almost the blessing of imposed deadlines, somebody else's schedule, collaboration, things that are done before that sort of lead a path for you in the editing process, allows you to have a little bit of a reassurance, and also guides you and forces you to do things on time, which is super helpful. But as we talked about last week, and as the video suggests, self-editing is a thing and it can be done successfully. And I think that I'm someone who did it for a while very unsuccessfully. And like I was talking about, being looped back and forth between large scale, small scale, you know, no deadlines, none of this. And that's chaos. That is not a healthy process. And that's not a process that's very productive and doesn't really lead to much. And it also is absent of collaboration and very detached from the publishing process, which those are all very important things to know, even if you are self-editing. So if you're somebody who, whatever your publishing process looks like, is editing in an isolated, solitary way, whether or not you have experience elsewhere in the publishing industry, it's important to realize those things as you go into self-editing. You can do these things successfully on your own, but you need to be aware about collaboration that's going to be involved later on, the need for other people involved in the process, even if they aren't there right now, the need for self-imposed deadlines, which I believe last week Emily and I talked about. So looking back there and making sure that you stick to some sort of plan, especially in editing, is very important. In drafting, that's a more open-ended process. I believe deadlines are important. I believe outlines and plans are important, but you can get away with eventually finishing a manuscript first draft without those things involved. Granted, it's rougher. I don't recommend doing that, but I do think that is a process that is a little more open-ended. Editing, whether or not people involved, please stick to these fundamentals and please understand that they need to be involved. And this sort of leads to a couple comments that I'm seeing. One from someone who's watching the video, Ramses Farrow, said, thoughts like, am I overwriting? Is the timing in this scene correct? How much should I edit now? And if what should I focus on at that time? It can become almost paralyzing at times. Thank you. I think that's really interesting in talking about self-editing and not getting paralyzed and in your writing process, basically, and to compartmentalize, like you said, between sectioning off problem by problem and phase by phase and scale by scale, really. So, you know, taking different problems within the developmental process and talking about the large scale, and then focusing on questions like these, you know, am I overwriting? Is the timing of this scene correct? You're starting to get a little more small scale. So that's less of a question, but more of something that touches on what we were saying. Emily is here with a question that we can answer. Do you prefer drafting or editing? Now that is a question that's just, you know, gets right to it, talking about the difference between drafting and editing. And if an author finds one harder than the other, do you have any advice for getting through the hard parts when you're not motivated? Kyra, I'll let you take the first part of this because I am curious to hear what you say.
Okay, I have a very nuanced answer to this question. I think that drafting is more fun. Like, here's the thing. I think the actual act of drafting is more fun when I successfully hold my self-editor in check. Because when that starts to seep in, I get frustrated with the presence of my self-editor. See? So that can make drafting frustrating. But when I'm successful in holding my self-editor at bay, I'm fine. also have more, I guess, experience with editing just throughout my schoolwork, my career, etc., etc. So in editing, I could just fully embrace my perfectionistic tendencies. Again, perfection is an asymptote that will approach for eternity. But you see what I'm saying? So I find drafting more fun, but editing more satisfying because I'm not holding anything back. I'm just like, yes, we're gonna slice. I don't know. I don't know. It's a bit more. It could be drafting's more cathartic. Editing is more refined. So it really just depends. But in terms of that's my answer to the first part.
Oh yeah. Oh no, that's amazing. I love what you're saying, because I think you saying that has helped me realize I think I really like one very, very particular part of the editing process the best, and that is developmental editing. And that's, between drafting or editing, that for me is like the perfect middle point. And granted, it's not everything bleeding together. Like we said, it's compartmentalized, it's on its own, but it has so many elements of creativity still involved without the open-endedness and kind of frustrations that are involved with drafting that make it so difficult, that make it very much so a self-oriented process where you have to implement these different strategies. You have the manuscript in front of you, and you can take a deep breath and go, oh, here it is. Here's this version of it. Now let me look at these giant blocks, these giant pieces of the puzzle, and move one here, get rid of this one. And I really like that slashing and just curating, like you said. But on the large scale, I think that's so fun. On the small scale, it starts to get more tedious, personally. And that sort of leads into the other question that's here is, if an author finds one harder than the other, do you have any advice for getting through the hard parts? I honestly think the copy editing portion for me is the hardest in terms of focus and the hardest in terms of having fun. It's not necessarily the most difficult to attain or do, because there are tools like spell check. There are editors you can hire, which is going to be our next question. I will get to that in a sec. But that to me is the most tedious part of the process, even if it is sort of the easiest. And maybe it's because it's the easiest that makes it the hardest. I don't know how to say that. What about you, Kyra? And do you have strategies? Well, I guess I got to say a strategy for mine. My strategy, I'll save it. What about?
No, you can share your strategy, sir.
I'm going to tie it into the next question.
Okay. So I think for me, it's weird. I feel like I'm drawn to both extremes. I like pure idea phase and nitty gritty sentence phase.
Oh, okay.
Like, I think I'm drawn to both because I have experience with engaging in both spaces. I think the phase of the process that is the most, not stressful, but like the most interesting for me and potentially overwhelming is the incorporation of beta reader feedback. I enjoy receiving the feedback, but I don't know the extent to which I need to incorporate it, because there's kind of like that weird balance between how much of this book is a product of my imagination and how much is this book a amalgam of what I imagine and what discussions I'd like to start, bearing in mind the feedback of the readership I want. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
So that piece of editing is interesting. So for people who, like, in terms of advice for getting through the hard parts when you're not motivated, I think that particularly in the editing process where you're incorporating somebody else's feedback, whether it's a beta reader or whether it's, as we're about to talk about in a bit, like a professional editor, bear in mind that if it's a beta reader, they might not be experts. They might not be experts in like how to make a book good, but at the end of the day, like the fact that they gave their opinions, if you find some of them constructive, it's ultimately your book and your story, right? When it comes down to experts, and again, I won't expound on this too much because we're about to talk about it in a second. When it comes down to experts, you aren't obligated to agree with everything they say, but bear their expertise in mind, right? Because at the end of the day, it's your book and your vision, but they're ultimately, like most of the time, they have your intentions. They have your interest in mind and have the best intentions. Now, if they're doing something that might inadvertently undermine or contradict some core aspect of the book, like say you use language that is integral to your main character's identity and they don't know what that is, like that, if anything, reinforces the importance of why you should perhaps world build as to why that language use is so important, etc., etc.
Definitely.
So ultimately, getting through the hard parts involves communication with yourself, and reminding yourself of this entire book process will eventually lead to communication with other people.
Yes, I love hearing about the beta reader aspect again, and kind of touching on that. A strategy I kind of thought about almost after the fact with beta reading, because it is hard. It is hard to know what to take and what to leave, and who to ask and how to get that involved at that point in the editing process. Basically, something that I walked away with was the opinions that are there from beta readers. The opinions that are there are more so just to give you a gauge on the overall experiences that readers might have. And you can do with or with not that, what you will with that information as you're editing and going on with it. But there are other things that beta readers are extremely, tactically useful for in editing. And that is literally being constructive in a correction. That is wrong. That doesn't sound right to me, a beta reader might say. And I had a beta reader catch something that was an error. It wasn't an opinion about the story. It was an error. And that was super helpful. And that was something that got past other professional editors and got past people who were involved in the process, because this beta reader had particular experience with the thing they were pointing out, and helped me realize, oh my gosh, that's something that would have gone out and never would have been caught. I'm so glad it was caught. Then there are other things that same beta reader may be like, I don't know if I like this for that character so much. That can be something I gauge, and maybe I'll use it, maybe I won't. But that's sort of how I went about with beta reading, and I think it was helpful and made the process work well for me. And kind of going back to what Ramses Farrow commented in terms of the actual editing questions and the compartmentalization and strategies for getting through that, this is kind of my solution. Is maybe not so much a solution a lot of people who want to self-edit and keep distance from others and keep it within their own power completely may not want to hear, but the solution really is to hire professionals. And that's can be a really tough thing. It's like, there's not a perfect solution to a lot of those problems. Now, if you've implemented different compartmentalization strategies, you've done these things, and you're getting through the self-editing process by yourself fine, that's great, and that's awesome, and that's working for you. But if you're implementing these ideas and you're trying them out for yourself, and you're still having these troubles in setting deadlines, and you're still having a hard time being motivated, and you're still getting everything muddled and mixed together, now's the time to implement a professional. And sometimes for some authors, you may not even be able to test that out yourself before going to this option. And if you only have a certain window to get your book done, and there's not editors built in based on your self-publishing process, let's say you want to self-publish your book in 6 months and you have to do it quickly, err on the side of hiring a professional instead of let me feel this out first and spend a couple of weeks. Err on the side of getting professional help. And if your budget's small, which you totally understand, totally respect, what kind of professional editor should you prioritize hiring first? Kyra, do you have a gut instinct on that one?
I think I'm torn. It depends on the kind of writer that you are. I'm torn between one of 3 options. If drafting is the area that you feel the most struggle with in terms of maintaining continuity in your idea, or maintaining focus in your initial idea, developmental editor. I also personally think that the developmental editor is one of the most fun to engage with. If you're looking for somebody to hold you accountable to making bigger edits with a manuscript that you feel is already developmentally sound, a revisions editor. And lastly, if you feel that you've reached a point in your manuscript that is developmentally sound and strong from a revision standpoint, you've done a couple of iterations of it already, then a copy editor, just to make sure that it's polished and looked over with a professional eye. So I would say in an ideal scenario, you'd have access to all 3, but it really just depends on if you need to choose one of the 3. It depends on where you feel most confident in your writing abilities, or in your, not just your writing ability, just in your general preferences in the process.
Definitely. Yeah, and I think we were both not lucky per se, but just happened to be our publishing model that we got all three, and they functioned sort of, for us at least, they functioned where a developmental editor came in, did their job, and the revisions editor is kind of there guiding you as a bridge between that developmental edit and then the copy edit that would come in at the end. So they were sort of like a midpoint person, our main editor. But that doesn't necessarily mean that particular person is the editor that you should, the general you as an author should get to help with your book. Like Kyra, like you're saying, think about what your weaknesses are, think about what your strengths are. And if you have to operate on a budget and you can really only afford one and you want to get your book out there, then prioritize an area of weakness. But that being said, try and get all three. Try and be in a point, even if you are self-publishing, which I imagine so many of you are doing, try and find a way to get all three, or at least an extra set of eyes, even if it is somebody who you know who's not necessarily charging you very much or anything at all, and they may be a professional writer in some other area or capacity, and you know they're really, really good at grammar checking and copy editing. If you want to save money off of the copy editing, maybe get them to help. Or it could be a vice versa thing. Maybe you have other ways to implement people in your life who are near professionals or professionals in these areas that you can do on a budget. But that being said, if you want to get all three, don't skim and cheap out to get all three. That's the other thing. And that's what's really tough, is you also don't want to just give an editor $50, professional editor off of some site, and then say, hey, you're editing my book. That job's not going to be complete. That job's not going to be done well. No matter how good they are. It's just that's not how paying for labor and paying for help and time usually works. So this is sort of the moment where most authors realize, oh my gosh, getting my book from manuscript to publishing is expensive. The degree to which it is expensive varies wildly, and you can make a great book on a smaller scale with a smaller scale budget. However, there is a budget involved, and this is sort of the hard truth coming in. But I know there are a lot of authors too who have professional experience themselves in, let's say, developmental editing or any phase of the editing process. Maybe you trust yourself to focus on that. But like we're saying, remember to implement those ideas of compartmentalization, and don't let that aspect bleed in too much into your drafting phase or into your later editing phases. I think one thing that I'm starting to think about too is I like to relate things to movies, and something that I realize is I watch a movie and then I walk out of it and I immediately am starting to critique like the story and the overall things they do with the characters and these very high level concepts, not so much the smaller moments. And so that's kind of given me my insight into even how I think about books. I think on that level more so. And so maybe that would be one of my strengths. And I would have gone into the process thinking, okay, if I wanted to save, I could maybe handle that aspect myself or find somebody to bring in, and maybe do a little gut check if you're not sure where your strengths lie, or you're not sure, even if you are hiring editors or you have that built into your publishing process. If you just want to know more about yourself as an author, do a little gut check in terms of how you read, how you watch movies, how you interact with stories, and then reflect back, okay, what does this say about me and how I think about my book? And how can I compartmentalize these aspects of myself going into that? And I think you bringing that up, Kyra, about really sectioning off each part of the editing process is sort of the key takeaway for how to go about it at all and how to start it and going from large scale to small scale. So I thank you for bringing that up, and thank you in general just for coming by. Do you have any other final pieces of wisdom, as you like to say on coffee chats, which are amazing here on manuscripts? I'm curious if you have any takeaways.
So 2 quick things. One, in terms of where you can find beta readers, particularly you could ask people in your life, your friends, your family. There's this one tool that I've been investigating recently called critiquematch.com. It sounds intriguing. I can't like fully vouch for it yet, but I've only seen good experiences thus far, and it's free from what I understand. You can be paired with professional beta readers as well, but you being aligned with fellow beta readers is free. So there's that. But beyond that, I would also say it's funny because just to piggyback off of what Vincent was saying in terms of relating this to movies, because it's all different mediums of storytelling. I realize that I'm the person who can talk about the big concepts and enjoys talking about the big concepts, particularly when movies are interrelated to each other. But my mind immediately critiques like transitions between scenes or
Oh,
like
okay.
plot holes that I see. I'm like, that sentence didn't make sense, or like, why did you say that there? Like, I wonder, like, is it just bad acting? Did I miss something? So I guess that kind of shows that my brain is sort of split between the extremes of like micro moments and like big picture, and where my weakness lies is more of the trying to express continuity between the two, because I tend to get like either hyper focused on the details or the exact opposite of I can build this world forever. What story? You know what I'm saying? So I think like acknowledging, I think that what you just described, Vincent, is a great way to help authors really come to terms with where their strengths are or even where their interests are, you know.
Yeah.
Just so they can align with somebody to fill in the gaps in that skill set. Or, I mean, it's also just sort of fun to riff with somebody in the space where you feel confident, because then you'll just feel even more confident going throughout the process. So,
True.
Yeah.
And I love that. I love that idea of riffing too. And that kind of ties back to if you are self-publishing and you need other author support and you don't want your process to be closed off, even though it is a self-publishing, self-motivated, powered publishing process for you, reach out to other authors. There are tons of authors out there, tons of indie authors out there, tons of self-published authors out there, and there are great communities. And really tap into those networks. And a lot of them, most of them, that's free. That's support. That's advice. That's help from people who want to help you and want to interact with you and share ideas. And that's just a great way to engage with other people. And I think that will only improve your publishing process and your writing process and editing, like we're talking about today, especially. So I love that. And that's an amazing takeaway. Kara, thank you so much for coming by. Thank you to Emily for doing so many of these streams as well. And thank you for everybody for watching, because I had a really great time doing these streams. And please stay tuned with us. We're going to keep doing Write With Me's. We're going to keep engaging with your writing process. And right before we leave, I want to share this comment. I believe it's also important. Any of the 3 editors, like a beta reader, is familiar with your genre. Incredibly grateful, much needed motivating engine. Thank you so much, Ramses Farrow. I really appreciate that you're watching and that this is engaging with you. And also, I love that takeaway. It's very important that they are familiar with your genre, very much so. You need to find somebody who's familiar with, especially as you get into outreach to a particular audience. That's super important. And remember that that's always at the end of your pipeline and your writing process is you're eventually going to show this to readers. So never be too far away from that in your mind, and never feel so closed off and isolated in your writing process that that's not a part of your thoughts. So that's very, very true. And thank you all for watching these, and we will see you again in another stream. Kyra will see you over on Coffee Chats, and much love to you all.
Thanks so much, guys.
Bye.